So yesterday in one of the guided meditations that we listened to, you had us imagine we were a newborn infant, not knowing anything about our sensations. There was no name to any of that. Um, but as a child grows in this world that we live in, they're taught this is the hand, this is your head, this is your chin. And and you also talk a lot about how we as adults, we have all these layers in our body that we're trying now to release and that sort of thing. So my question is, how do you balance with a child teaching them these cultural things about who they are as a form with this understanding that that is just a manifestation of being aware?
When a child is born, it is a child doesn't know that it has been born. It doesn't know that it is an infant. It doesn't know that it has been born into a world. Its experience is just one homogeneous mass of pure experiencing. It cannot distinguish between its body and its mother's body, between the pain in its stomach and the sensation of its hand on the side of its cot. Or it's just one undifferentiated mass of experience, a little bit like a fish in the ocean. The fish doesn't know that it's a fish, and it doesn't know that it's in the ocean. So after a while, I don't know, 18 months or so, the child begins to separate itself out from experience. It begins to conceptualize itself as an entity that is distinct and separate. In other words, the I thought arises and is associated with its body, and it begins to separate its body out as a me entity to distinguish it from its mother and its father and its environment. And this is a natural process. It's not wrong. It's not ignorant. It's the beginning of the ego. It is born in a pre-egoic state, in which consciousness is completely merged in experience. So in this, as the I thought begins to develop, and it begins to develop around a body, the ego, consciousness begins, it's very closely identified with the body, but it begins to separate itself out from experience. In fact, this is the beginning of the Neti Neti process. The Neti Neti process, for those of you that are not familiar with the term, means I'm not this, I'm not that, which is a kind of meditation that is sometimes used in the Indian tradition to come to the realization that we are consciousness. I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my feelings, I am consciousness. And in fact, this is what the child is doing. The child is beginning this process. I am not this. I thought that I was my mother's body, but I see that there's a distinction. I'm not that. I'm not the sight of this room. I'm not the sight of my cot. I'm not the sounds that are going on. It's the beginning of the Neti Neti process. And it takes the child as far as I am this body. That is the development of the ego, the identification of what I am, consciousness, with the body. And after several years, this identification of consciousness with the body is complete. What happens in most cases is that consciousness remains for the rest of its life, for the rest of the life of the individual, stuck at that level, or with that understanding. All that takes place in the spiritual process is that Neti Neti process, we just continue it. we continue the process that actually is naturally happening through childhood. Having separated ourselves out from our surroundings and from our parents and from others, we just continue that separating process. Having discovered that I am not my mother and my father, or my brother or my sister, I'm not my cot, I'm not my environment, I'm not any of that. I now begin to discover I'm not my thoughts either. They come and go just like my mother comes and goes. I'm not my sensations. They come and go just like my father comes and goes. I'm not my feelings. I'm not. We carry on the I am not this, I am not that process until we get to a stage. What's left when we remove everything from ourselves? What's left? What cannot be removed from myself? What doesn't disappear? What is with me always? And there is this recognition, the only element of my experience that isn't coming and going, that cannot be removed from me, is simply the experience of being aware. But that is the culmination of the I am not this, I am not that process. But then there is a further step, which is the recognition of the ever-present, unlimited nature of awareness. Having discovered I am awareness, I am the experience of being aware, then to discover that that has no limits. That is the post-egoic realization. Now, at this stage there is still this duality between I awareness and the objects of the body-mind world. The child separates itself from the world and thinks I, the body-mind, know the world. In the mature adult separates themselves not just from the world, but from the body-mind also, and realizes I am pure awareness. That is what's called enlightenment. But then we have to reconcile I awareness with the body-mind world. And in this, and that's what we do in our yoga meditations, in this coming together of the body-mind world, instead of consciousness being merged in experience, as was the case for the infant and the animal, experience is merged in consciousness. Do you see the difference? For the infant and the animal, consciousness has completely lost itself to the sea of experience. There is just a sea of undifferentiated experience. That's the pre-egoic state that infants and animals are in. Then the ego begins to develop, first of all by associating itself with the body-mind. And then it continues to develop, it realizes itself as pure consciousness. But then when it goes back as pure consciousness to look at the objects of the body-mind world, the body-mind world are realized to be made of consciousness. In other words, experience is merged in consciousness. In the post-egoic state, consciousness is merged in experience in the pre-egoic state. This, by the way, for those of you that are familiar with Neo-Advaita teachings, explains the misunderstanding in Neo-Advaita teachings. This is just an aside, by the way, that may be interesting for some people. The Neo-Advaita teachings misunderstand the pre-egoic state for the post-egoic state. They don't distinguish between the two. What they're describing is a pre-egoic state where consciousness is merged in experience. It's something quite different from what we're speaking of here, where experience is merged in consciousness.
But in our culture, children aren't generally allowed to find this understanding for themselves.
Yes, sorry, that was a very long way round answering your question. So I would bring children up with freedom and love. I have a 15-year-old child. I've never spoken to him about these matters. because he's never asked me about them. And I wouldn't unless he did. I'm very close to him. So I'm always, in our conversations, in an indirect way, I'm always conveying my love and understanding to him, but in a way that is tailored to his interests and to what is relevant for him in his stage of life. I never put it in terms that are relevant to me or that are relevant to my stage of life. I always tailor them to him. And in his case, it means never talking about this directly. Just because that's the character he is. He doesn't want to. Another child would want to explore this more directly, although it's unusual for children. But I don't think it's important to speak directly of these matters. What's more important is the quality of love and freedom that we give to our children. That plants a kind of seed in them. The most important thing is to keep that alive.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much.